Same old game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger potion.
So simple.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for May 8th, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody. Brendan, I've come here to chew bubble gum and kick ass, and I'm all out of bubble gum.
Oh, that means I'm the fall guy, right?
Yeah! We're here to take a few falls, quote, a few action films, and...
That sounds like fun.
You know, yeah.
Just don't dislocate your knee
into
again.
a fight or two. Oh my gosh. The one thing we actually didn't talk about this in our Challengers conversation. I'm surprised that we didn't, because we got wrapped up in our debate, and it's not often that Brendan and I find ourselves in these heated debates as we were with that movie.
Yeah.
So I kind of lost track of it, but one of the more, I guess, visceral moments of that film for me was when Tashi gets hurt and you hear the crunch of her knee there, and
you see it too. It's close up. It is straight up out of a Saw movie.
Dude, I had full on panic attack. Like, I had PTSD. Oh my God, it was horrible. Like, I was like physically, I don't want to say in pain, but I felt like this tingling sensation all throughout my body. It was absolutely a nightmare to watch that on screen in that film. Because for context, if we have any new listeners out there, I've dislocated my patella 6 different times. It's not fun. It is awful. I would not wish that upon my worst enemy. So I very much recognize her pain. I've literally felt her pain in that moment. And the other little detail with that film that we didn't really talk about is in the scenes where it takes place at the Challenger event and she's sitting there in the stands, you can see the scar on her knee from where she would have had surgery.
Oh yeah, the movie does a good job setting you up that is about to happen at some point, and the movie is paced in a certain way that you can kind of tell which match it's going to happen in. But it was to the point where she and Tashi and Patrick, I believe it was, they have this argument in, his dorm room, and she's doing her stretches.
Yeah.
I thought, is it going to happen here? like I was like so on edge because of that, but the movie does play with that suspense. It's coming pretty soon. I have to give credit to my wife Maris for this, because she can't handle that kind of stuff. She needs to know ahead of time when it's about to happen. And we were in a theater that was very non-populated. We were practically the only ones there. So I don't feel bad that she, for a moment, took out her phone and was looking at something. The match started, and she said, "I'll be right back. I have to go to the bathroom." And that was the indicator. Like, you looked it up if it was going to happen now, didn't you? And the second she walked back into the theater, Tashi was already getting her knee iced in the other room.
Yeah. Look, I don't blame her. I don't blame her at all. I knew it was coming because obviously it's in the trailer. In fact, I was bracing for that first match there.
I was too.
And it doesn't happen. It's, a riveting moment, honestly. And there's some interesting details even within that scene we didn't really talk about, because Tashi, given details that we find out later about that match and how she speaks to her opponent, like there's some interesting like social I guess subtext to that sequence that we didn't really talk about that I do find kind of fascinating.
Oh sure.
But I was waiting for that moment to happen. It certainly didn't. And so, when she had the match there at Stanford, I was very much braced. I was like, this is it. This is where it happens.
And I was ready for it.
And even though I was ready for it, it still sent chills down my spine. Like, it's awful. Like, it's an injury I do not recommend at all. It sucks. Ugh. It is brutal. And I've had 2 surgeries. So like like that detail, that scar that you see on Tashi there, I have 2 of those. I have 2 of them.
Man.
And you know, by the second one, admittedly, I did as much as I could with the first one to try to mitigate the physical scar on the first one, because there's like different creams and things you can do to kind of help
soften it and blend it in, things like that.
The second one, I was like, screw it, I'm done. I don't know who I'm trying to impress. I don't care anymore.
Hey, who was it that said scars make you strong? It was Koba from Dawn of the Planet of the Apes.
There you go. Yes. Yeah, human work. And it's true. My scar is also human work.
Human work.
I can relate with Koba there.
I'm gonna start calling you Koba from now on.
At any rate, I had not quite that visceral response in the Fall Guy, but yeah, there's moments when you see these stuntmen like rolling on concrete and getting hit by cars and stuff, and I'm like, oh my god, that would destroy my knee. My leg would be shattered in all kinds of places. And
sure,
yeah, it's like I struggle. Like, even though I love hockey, obviously I'll watch it religiously.
Yeah,
and there are still times, even when a goalie goes down in this awkward position, and I struggle to stomach that kind of stuff anymore. Like, I can't do it. Like, these injuries have caused permanent psychological damage to me. So
yeah, makes me worried, because I do a lot of running still, and I'm close to 35. So am I 35? I've gotten to that age where I have to do math to figure out how old I am.
Oh, I know. I have no idea.
I do that all the time. Okay, I'm almost 35. I just had to figure that out. I'll be 35 later this year, but I do a lot of running, and every time I get to a point where I'm running for like 2 miles or something, I think to myself, don't pull a JD here. Just take it slow.
Yeah. I mean, you'd have to have the worst legs in the world to dislocate your patella from running.
Yeah.
Like non-contact. Yeah. Your legs are
screwed. I'm not doing suicides either, so there's no agility to it. It's more about endurance than it is about, what you're talking about.
If you're dislocating your knee, you've had contact. You physically hit something in an awkward position, and your knee was like, no, thank you.
Maybe I should say when I was still playing soccer, I did think about it.
Soccer happens all the time.
Yeah.
So yes. Yeah. At any rate, I hope none of the stuntmen in the Fall Guy dislocated their knees, because that sucks. But yeah, we're here to talk about David Leitch's latest film, The Fall Guy. Brennan, without further ado, are you ready to get into this, my friend?
Let's start falling.
All right. It is directed by David Leitch, The Fall Guy. That is, it stars Ryan Gosling, Emily Blunt,
Barbenheimer,
Aaron Taylor Johnson, Hannah Hannah Weddingham, Teresa Palmer, Stephanie Sue, Winston Duke, and a few others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with The Fall Guy, a down-and-out stuntman must find the missing star of his ex-girlfriend's blockbuster film.
Simple and effective.
Yeah,
simple and effective.
Pretty simple.
Yeah, and given the box office numbers, you might not be familiar with this film, unfortunately.
I know, which we talked about quite extensively on the main show this last week, if you want to go and check that out. To give a little bit more detail, because I assume we're going to talk about it here in just a minute, Ryan Gosling plays Colt Seavers, who is a seasoned action stuntman.
Yeah.
I guess this is maybe slight spoilers. It happens early on in the film, and it'll be a part of this conversation. He finds himself in this stunt. I'll just say it goes wrong.
Yeah.
It doesn't go according to plan. And he is forced to step away from the profession for a little while. In the meantime, Emily Blunt, who is his girlfriend in those opening scenes, she is now the director of this new Hollywood blockbuster that is taking place. And they need
basically this like combination of Mad Max and Dune is basically what it is.
We'll get into that. I certainly want to talk about that as far as my feelings on the film, but
sure.
They're making that movie. They need a stunt person. and Colt is called upon. But Jodie, Emily Blunt's character, is unaware that Colt has been called upon, which creates some interesting, awkward tension as Colt arrives to the film. So that is, I guess, in a little bit more detail what the synopsis is hinting at. And the star of this Hollywood blockbuster film that Jodie is making is played by Aaron Taylor Johnson. The character name is Tom. He is missing, and Colt has to go find him. So
that's it.
Now that that's laid out in a little bit more detail, Brendan, what did you think about The Fall Guy?
It is also based on a television show, which I have not watched. But that doesn't make it IP. We sort of talked about that a little bit on the main show about its box office results. Just because it's based off of something doesn't necessarily make it an IP type of film. It's still, from a marketing standpoint, this feels like an original property, which is why the box office numbers, at least thus far, we'll hold out hope that it pulls off another Elemental-like run. But the box office numbers thus far are kind of disappointing that a big movie like this isn't doing as well as I think it should have. I do think this is a good movie. And I think it's the kind of movie that you would like to see do well because it just has that kind of charisma. And I have to give the movie a lot of credit because it's trying to operate at 4 different levels. It's trying to operate as an action movie all on its own, as a tribute to stuntmen, as sort of this commentary on production interference when it comes to big blockbuster films. I'm sure we'll talk about that. And it's also functioning as a romantic comedy. I think of those 4, it's at its best as a romantic comedy of all things. I really do. In the middle of all this, we're going to be also recording a review for the new Anne Hathaway film, The Idea of You. And it's interesting that I think The Fall Guy is a better romantic comedy than that film is.
Brendan, for the record, and this is not the first time this has happened, which is why this is so funny to me. But just to lay my cards out on the table right now, he is reading verbatim from my notes.
You're welcome.
And this happens, I feel like at least a couple of times a year where Brendan he'll start out with his opening thoughts. I'm looking at my notes and I'm going, this is word for word what I have here. Why am I even... Brendan should just do this by himself.
No, I shouldn't do this by myself because there's at least one thing about this film that I think we might have a disagreement on.
For sure.
And if you've seen my Letterboxd review or my my tweet about the film, you probably know where I'm getting at. But there is one component here of those 4 layers that I mentioned. There's one component I don't think fully works for me, but the film works great as a romantic comedy. I actually think it is very effective as a love letter to stuntmen and as a commentary and production interference. I think those 3 layers are really effective. The rom-com angle being the strongest, weirdly speaking. And I am willing to be swayed based on this conversation on how well the film functions as an action flick. Because I think here is where I found it a little bit vanilla. And I think it's more so to do with editing and cinematography than anything else, because clearly, and you alluded to this when we were talking about knee injuries of all things, there is clearly a lot of great stunt work happening in this movie. The end credits showcase that. Yet the end credits I thought were more visually dazzling than anything we got in the movie itself. I think it's more so how these sequences are captured and rendered. Because I still think they carry a lot of those samey, shiny, digitized kind of vibes that we get from most action blockbusters these days. So when you have a chase through the streets of Australia and Ryan Gosling and or his stuntman is riding on the back of a pickup truck, kind of, almost like snow gliding on the road,
like surfing on the pavement. Yeah,
it didn't convince me. It just didn't convince me. And there are a lot of moments like that where the action itself I found rendered in a way that I wish it was just a little bit more adventurous to really capture what these stuntmen were actually doing. So that's really my biggest criticism of the movie. And sadly, it is kind of a big one because this is a movie that I think really needed that edginess and that practicality to really shine through. And I don't think it always does. But as a story, I think it mostly still saves the experience because of how charismatic that it is, because of how great Emily Blunt and Ryan Gosling are together, because of the unicorns, which we'll also talk about. Like, this is a very funny movie.
Yeah.
And taking it as purely a comedy and a romantic comedy at that, I do think the film is a success. And I would love to see it do well, just given the fact that it's not as IP driven as what you tend to see as quote unquote marketable these days. So wish I loved it more, but I still enjoyed the experience because where it does work very well.
Yeah, I'm definitely higher on this than Brendan. I quite loved it. I thought it was very funny. It has a ton of charm. As Brendan is talking about there, it's this ode to the stunt community. And as a love letter to the stunt community, it is remarkably pure of heart. There's a deep love and reverence for action stunts and the people that put themselves on the line for our enjoyment. I mean, in general, there's an affable sincerity for cinema and the stronghold it has on culture. There's a plethora of direct references to other movies, some of them verbally, some of them invoked through objects such as Colt's Miami Vice jacket. The action itself may not be inventive or Tom Cruise level of crazy. And I empathize with why that may be disappointing since this is a love letter to the stunt community, but I think the film finds a middle ground between its stunt work and comedic ethos. It is not trying to be Mission Impossible. It is not trying to be John Wick. It is a slapstick, romantic action comedy at its core. And I think the action here reflects that very well. As much as I admire the idea of strapping yourself to a plane or falling down 30 flights of stairs, I don't think that is called for here, weirdly, at least tonally speaking. The fact that it's kind of goofy and diverting is in line with the film's heart and established tone. And we still see some pretty captivating stunt work in the middle of it all. Most notably, they've marketed heavily that Logan Holiday, one of the stunt guys here, broke the Guinness World Record for car rolls in a single scene at 8.5,
I think rolls. It was. Yeah. Yeah,
we also see a guy fall from a helicopter onto a giant inflatable. They jump a car over a cliff. They light a guy on fire half a dozen times and throw him into a rock wall. It's not as if it's devoid of good stunt work. They just frame it in a way that serves this story. And I didn't really mind that at all.
Okay.
I had fun with that. But you are right. This film works best as a romantic comedy.
Absolutely.
And I agree with you. As I noted, I have written here, it is better than The Idea of You, which we'll talk about. But it is incredible how electric this film is as a romantic comedy. Ryan Gosling and Emily Blunt have striking chemistry. They're really great together. If I was John Krasinski, I would be it would be awkward watching this
I'd be
movie.
jealous. I'd be jealous. Yeah.
They have great chemistry. And I think the film is awesome as a romantic movie. Yeah. It really is great in that regard. I agree with you as far as the film working as this commentary for production interference. I think it's very good in that regard as well. I enjoyed that. I overall love the buffoonery of this film. And I think it's totally committed to what it wants to be. Ryan Gosling is a capital M, capital S movie star, and he's embracing that in these incredible ways over the last couple of years that I equally enjoy as his, artistic, ambitious side that we've seen from him over the last decade as well. For him to be able to be in this era of Ryan Gosling, I think it's incredibly stimulating. It's certainly a lot of fun, and what he brings to this film and his character, I think, is just endlessly entertaining. So yeah, I love the film.
Yeah, it's to the point that if we ever get a sequel to this, it would probably have to be directed by John Krasinski at this point.
Yeah, and he might have to. He's got to rein that in a little bit.
They could have a little bit of fun with that. That could be a pretty interesting meta idea to play with if they ever do decide to do the Fall Guy 2, or what would they call that? The Fall Guys, the Fall Gal, maybe. You can have a little bit of fun with that. But yeah, their chemistry, Gosling and Blunt specifically, is. I mean, there are a lot of reasons to see this movie. I would argue that maybe the best reason to see it is that it's a movie that does love stuntmen, right?
Yes.
And it does play with that in a kind of meta way. There's a joke about how stuntmen are not awarded Oscars at one point.
I love
too.
that movie. I like or that moment. And I love
Yeah.
that the camera simply lingers on Colt as he says, "No, there are no Oscars." Like, why would you even ask that question? Like, it's so
like
hilarious.
It's in the moments like that where I found the film more effective as a tribute to the stunt community than just the action scenes were. Like the commentary on the stunt community, I thought was very sweet and very honest. I really enjoyed that aspect of it. But yeah, just to get back to my overall point, there is a meta quality to the film that I found that could have easily been the problem, because there are so many movies that try to be meta and it comes off as kind of desperate. But this one, I think, finds a way to make it all seamlessly work. We sort of jokingly talked about that the film Emily Blunt's character of Jodie is directing is very reminiscent of blockbusters that we see nowadays, right? Visually, it is kind of carbon copy of Mad Max and Dune, and even something like Galaxy Quest is thrown in there. It's got all of these things. It certainly has a familiarity to it, which sort of adds a grounded nature to the overall scheme that's going on here, which we don't want to get into for spoilers' sake, but I was able to buy into not just the joke, but also the commentary around the joke. So I think the film, as a piece of storytelling, does a good job kind of balancing all of those things tonally to make that all work and function. But it all comes back to Gosling and Blunt. They have a moment on a phone call together.
The split screen moment.
Well, you know what I was reminded of during that moment? I was thinking of that great split screen moment from, remember Down with Love, the Peyton Reed film with Ewan McGregor and Renee Zellweger?
Yeah.
They have a really great split screen moment where they actually kind of interact with each other mid split screen, and it's really playful and really entertaining. This is not quite on that level, but it doesn't need to be. It's not asking itself to be. But they have a lot of fun in a meta way with it about the notion of split screen in movies and how it functions in movies. So I thought the playfulness there was really complimentary to their chemistry.
That's what I love about this film. It is not afraid to be playful. It's certainly not afraid to be brazen with its meta qualities. And that was one of my favorite elements of the film, where Jodie is talking to Colt about this romantic moment between the two leads of the movie she's making. And she has this idea for a split screen moment, which then this film regurgitates, and we see them talk about it.
Right.
And how the film enacts those ideas in execution as they're having this conversation, invoking films like Notting Hill and Love Actually and it all as well. Is hilarious, and the performance,
getting the wrong Julia Roberts film as well.
I love that. Yeah, Pretty Women, I think, is brought up there in that conversation. Like, it's really fun how the film is able to have its cake and eat it too, in terms of bringing this romantic tension between Jodie and Colt, yet having fun in terms of the structure of movies, how they're made, and why creative minds might make a decision like that when they're trying to tell a story, even in a huge blockbuster movie, which this is trying to be, right? It's a summer movie, and it's this romantic comedy at its core. So it's obviously making fun of itself in that regard. And I think that's why the film overall works for me. There's just a general goofiness to this film. It is a slapstick comedy at its core, and it comes through in moments like that. It's also in, as you talked about before we even got into the conversation, the whole idea that this Hollywood blockbuster movie that Jodie is making is very, again, brazenly this Dune Guardians of the Galaxy ripoff, where at one point they even make fun of the Dune score. Like, Hans Zimmer is invoked in the score
they do.
at one point. Like, this is a very winky type of movie. It's got these parody qualities to it that I think are fantastic. And the gags that come through at times had me in stitches. The one that had me laughing the most, and I'll be vague here because this happens near the end of the film, but there's a moment with Aaron Aaron Taylor Johnson's character, where he gives this speech at the end, and it is not subtle at all, the impersonation. Not subtle at all. Like just full on impersonation. And I was rolling.
It's so good. It's so bad, but that's why it's so good.
Exactly. Like there's no mistaking who he's trying to be there. Like it is very clear and vivid. And I love that the film goes full on into it.
Doesn't hide it.
Just the best. I can't wait for the film to come out on digital, so that will be clipped and will make its rounds on social media, because I'm ready to see that moment again. Aaron Taylor Johnson nails it. It's so hilarious.
I want to see David Leitch as a filmmaker kind of live more in this realm than, let's say, something like a Hobbs and Shaw, which got way too big for its own good, or a movie like Bullet Train that I wanted to like more than I did, but I think the intricacies of that plot just sort of overtook the movie, and he found himself lost in what he was doing as a filmmaker.
But that film similarly has a similar tone, though. Like there's a general goofiness to that film that he brings to this as well.
Yeah, it's certainly there in Bullet Train. I think there are other factors in that movie that sort of mask it and fail and basically fail the movie in the end. But here, I think David Leitch is at his best when he focuses on comedy, which is why this mostly works as a romantic comedy. And Deadpool 2 works as well as it does. In a way, I think Deadpool 2 might still be his best movie.
I love that film as well. I am absolutely no holds about it for me. I adore it. I agree with you. That's his best.
I do really like Atomic Blonde.
I like that one too.
Yeah, and I think that's the one that perhaps of his movies probably functions best as a pure action film. I think the action stunt work in that movie is indeed very impressive. It just might not have the storytelling strength that a movie like The Fall Guy has. It certainly has a really good script under its belt. And I think David Leitch does a really good job capitalizing on the humor that's on the page and the star charisma that he has in front of him. Yeah, because they really do make it work. For a movie that has a hallucinatory sequence involving unicorns, like that sounds terrible on paper. And it's kind of gut-bustingly hilarious at times.
It's great.
It's less so the idea of it. It's more so Gosling's reaction to it. It's a movie that takes advantage
and the timing of it.
Yeah, I was a little vague about how much I like the editing here, and I didn't always like it from an action film standpoint, but from a comedic standpoint, the editing really does work.
Well, and ultimately, that's why the action does work for me. I know that we'll debate this here, and we disagree, but the reason the action works for me is because it's not grounded, but because it's kind of goofy. Like it's kind of silly. Like the fact that it maintains this unbelievable, and I mean that literally, I guess, like this unbelievable quality, I think is great. Like I feel like that tone and the story, this slapstick narrative that is at the core here, like it sets up those set pieces very well. I don't find them random in that regard. And I think it's why those cheap qualities you talked about earlier, why I think they are tonally important. And I think that framing is important because, again, this isn't trying to be Mission Impossible or John Wick. And I can't help but think about that in comparison to something like Mission Impossible, which frames itself on the mythology that Tom Cruise is willing to do all of these things at all costs.
That's more self-serious than this
buildings and cliffs with his motorcycle, hang out the outside of a plane. And when it doesn't work in Mission Impossible, it's extremely noticeable. I think of that train sequence at the end of the last film. I didn't really care for it because it is so clearly CGI influenced, and it's a vivid contrast to him actually jumping off the cliff with his motorcycle, as we see in that film. And when a movie like that frames itself as, hey, we're doing all of these practical stunts, and then you throw in all of this heavy CGI, it is jarring. But this is a film that from the get-go infuses itself as this slapstick comedy that isn't trying to be practical in that way. It has its stunt work for sure. As we talked about earlier, we do see a stuntman fall from a helicopter and they roll that car for sure, but it's not afraid to indulge in those slapstick tones. So I didn't have a problem with the action scenes in that regard because of what this film is trying to be at its core. It is visually less compelling than something like John Wick or Mission Impossible. I don't disagree there, but tonally, I feel like what they accomplish here is better suited than if they tried to mimic those films.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think as far as the action scenes here and how they function tonally, I do agree. I think they're successful in that regard because they are staged or at least meant to convey a goofiness. I do agree with that. Honestly, that's not really my problem because I actually think that does work. I don't need to see John Wick levels of brutality here. That's certainly not what this movie needs. In fact, that would have been very distracting, and that would have gotten old very quick for me. But I guess I have a question here because it's not so much the tone of the action scenes, but I guess maybe how they're rendered and how they're composed, and I guess how they're framed, because that goofiness does lend itself to an editing fashion that I do think starts to mask some of the impressive stunt work that we're seeing. And it does make me ask the question, is that then the right approach for a movie that is also functioning as a love letter to the stunt community? And that's where I found a little bit puzzled by that, and where I thought it was a bit of a missed opportunity. Because when we do see a lot of these great stunts being performed, it got to a point where I started to lose that physicality because of how it was rendered in a way. So, like I said, when Ryan Gosling is surfing through the streets and then having a fist fight in the back of a truck with someone, I never got I never felt the gravity of that. I never felt, it got to a point where I didn't believe there were even stunt people on the scene. And that I think is a problem for a movie that is ultimately about the stunt community. So I guess I'm wondering if it took the right tonal approach, but maybe went too far with it for a film that is supposed to be about them. And maybe it just picked the wrong movie to go that far with it. I don't know. So I guess I wish there was more of a middle ground there.
Yeah, and I think that's very fair because while this is in a way an ode to the stunt community, there's no doubt about it. And as we've been talking about, the film is very sincere in that regard. It loves its stunt guys for sure.
Yeah.
And recognizes the challenges that comes along with being a stunt person in Hollywood. However, I do think this film pulls its punches in terms of that gravity because it's got to work tonally for this film. It's not trying to carry the same weight as Tom Cruise flying on the outside of an airplane, risking his life at, I don't know, 3,000 feet or however high they were. Like, there is a gravity to watching him when he's doing stunt work like that, or any stunt guy that is, performing something in camera in the ways that we see with John Wick or Mission Impossible. This film is not trying to mimic that, for sure. It pulls its punches, so the gravity of it, I don't think, is meant to be felt. And tonally, I think that works for this film and the story it's trying to tell. Does that simultaneously kind of undermine the love letter idea? I can see that argument. I can see that argument. For me, it doesn't, because again, I think the spirit of what they're trying to do is, hey, we love you guys, and we're going to incorporate as much of that here as we possibly can. And as we noted earlier, they do. Like, they roll that car 8.5 times, and much of it is all done in camera. A guy falls from a helicopter. Scene. That's all done in camera.
Actually, the opening stunt that sets this whole plot into motion, the wire work stunt,
which Gosling did himself.
That's the best stunt in the movie. But I don't necessarily need the movie to mirror that type of intensity every single time. I think, if anything, maybe my issue with the action sequences and how they're rendered really does come down to that one word, and that's rendering. And I think that might be more of a lighting or cinematography thing. We've seen this happen in other movies before, where we'll see what are perceivably great action scenes, but there's maybe a certain color grading to them that just kind of gives it this sheen to it that makes you kind of disbelieve what you're seeing, right? Like I know that there are real people fighting each other in this movie, but it's rendered in a way where I almost thought they were computer animated people. Like and I know they're not, but it's color graded in a way that makes it look faker than it probably really is. And we see that a lot in a lot of movies these days. It almost makes it look cheap. And not that this movie needs to look expensive or anything like that, but I think there's a pristine look to this from a color grading standpoint that makes it look even less practical than I think it even could have been based on what they did actually perform.
Yeah.
And I may be far with that. I don't know.
And again, I think all of that, or a lot of it anyway, is very intentional. I don't think that's an accident. And I didn't mind that because this film is trying to be a goofball.
Okay.
And I mean, it is very brazenly mimicking Dune throughout a lot of this film with like these Guardians of the Galaxy characters, you know, like and it's all done throughout the day, which is interesting. That's not typically how we see a lot of these stunts, you know, kind of rendered.
Sure.
You know, like, and like we're still seeing them fall onto the ground, getting hit by cars. Like that is all still done in camera. So like the stunts are there, like you see them. There's still a tangibility to the stunt work itself. The cinematography, I do agree, does make it weightless. And it does add a sheen to it. It does make it look cartoonish for sure. And I think that's exactly what the film is going for, because this is a cartoon at its core. And it comes through in the performances. It comes through in all of these, you know, narrative and directorial choices that we've been talking about in terms of the structure of this film and its meta qualities, especially.
Yeah.
So I didn't mind that that's how they wanted to render these action sequences, because the film is trying to be as goofy and as buffoonery as possible.
Well, it succeeds in that regard.
Yeah, I agree. Now, if a byproduct of that is it makes these stunts feel, you know, more weightless, and I would have wanted there to be more of a sincerity in giving those stunts more gravitas. I understand that criticism.
Yeah.
I think it's a fair argument to make. It just didn't bother me because the film didn't really care to, you know.
And I think that's really the dividing line between us. Yeah. And that is the dividing line between us, because it did bother me a little bit more, hoping to see more of that. It would have certainly bothered me less if this movie was not about stunt people or a love letter to them. I actually felt more sincerity and love for them in the narrative around stunt people within the movie. So like we referenced that joke about Oscars not awarding stunt people, right? It's moments like that where I felt a genuine kind of camaraderie for stunt people. And this movie, you're right, it does love the stunt community. And,
it does.
And why this movie still works is that even if I don't think the action sequences capitalize on the stunt community as well as I think it wanted to, I don't think it's a detraction either. I don't think it comes off as an offense against the stunt community. Like it doesn't go that far that it becomes an issue, that it contradicts its own ethos. It never goes that far.
I agree.
If anything, I would have loved to see it maybe tighten, to maybe add more of an enhancement to what it's already going for.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly fair. And while I have my preferences in terms of, or at least as I noted earlier, the way that the film captures these stunts and its cartoonishness, it doesn't bother me.
Right.
I would also argue, if we were debating merit and validity, I think that approach complements what this film is trying to be tonally. I don't think adding gravitas to this film would have made those stunts feasible here. Or maybe feasible is the wrong word, but it would have made for a more jarring and disjointed experience.
And it makes for another question, and I don't think we need to answer it here because we might not even have an answer. Is there a way for a movie like this to have it both ways, like we're talking about? Well, I don't know.
I think I think so. It just depends on approach, I guess, because this is a film that wants to be a slapstick comedy. How do you make a slapstick comedy but take the stunt seriously? Like, that just doesn't make any sense at all.
Unless you're Buster Keaton.
Well, yeah, but his films have a general, like,
well, there's a sense
of
danger to them.
I guess maybe you're asking the wrong person that, because I'm not the biggest Buster Keaton fan, and I don't think that he threads that needle all that well. I don't. Gotcha. I would argue it doesn't work in his movies as well as others claim them to be, but that's where I land on that, and maybe that's why I feel about this film the way that it does. I feel like if you're going to do an ode to the stunt community, but you want to take that more seriously, you have to tonally have a very different approach than what this film does. And that movie can be made. That's certainly going to be out there. And in a lot of ways, you can claim John Wick and Mission Impossible. Certainly there's other movies. I keep going back to those as examples here, but those are great examples of movies being an ode to stunt work, because they do take that seriously in those franchises. This film is a slapstick comedy. It is a romantic comedy. And
on those merits, it's a success on those merits. It really
is. I don't think you can take it all that seriously. Now, that's not to say or to forgive the cinematography and its, let's say, mediocrity. Because I don't disagree that it has a cartoonish, shiny, like the sheen to it that comparatively to other movies, it is less visually appealing. I agree. Totally agree with that. But I think that is a purposeful tactic here to heighten its cartoonish qualities. I think that's exactly what it's going for. And given that this film is trying to be this parody, it has these incredibly whippy one-liners throughout the film. One of my favorites is the moment when Colt is talking to Gail, and who is the producer on this blockbuster
the
movie.
Hannah Waddingham character.
And she's explaining her ethos in terms of how she views audiences, and she starts speaking about nihilism. And Colt simply replies that nihilism is the sexy bacon, which I just thought was like the way he says.
Is that a new
so
T-shirt
good.
idea for us?
I think so. I'm gonna have.
I think
to
it
make
is.
that.
I think it is. We found it.
Absolutely hilarious. I love that line, and there's so many great one-liners like that in the film. You think about Winston Duke and his character of Dan, and how he's constantly quoting other action movies, and this film just has
in this.
Oh my
that
gosh,
is how
you
utilize a supporting character. It is.
I agree.
Really well done.
He's fantastic here, and I love that playfulness in this film, and you couple it with just how winky this movie is, how brazen it is. It's trying. It is blatantly making maybe not making fun, but it is ripping off Dune to have some fun. Aaron Taylor Johnson's speech at the end. I mean, this is a film that does not have a serious bone in its body. How can I expect the cinematography and the actions to do the same? I just can't. That doesn't make it critic proof. You can criticize those things, but to me, it complements the characters. It complements that witty tone. It complements those one-liners and the commentary underneath all of that in terms of production and how these movies are made. I think it complements all of those things to make a seamless, uniform experience.
I would have loved to hear a joke about the way the movie looks in that regard if it wanted to get even more meta.
That would have, honestly, I think if they would have done that, it probably would have alleviated a lot of this conversation.
It probably would have, honestly. It probably would have, yeah. Because then it would have been part of, if they would have made my reservations part of the joke within the movie, and maybe it's there and I just didn't notice it, but if I feel like it was more apparent in that regard, because this is a very meta movie and it's not secret about that. It's very direct. It's very blunt. It's not even subtle. If you miss it, you're just not listening. It's that on the nose. And that's not a problem. A movie sometimes needs to be on the nose for its goofy nature to land. I mean, this is a farce. This is more in line with something like Tropic Thunder.
Yes.
It's very much like
is. That's a great comp. Yeah. And maybe it's there in, and I don't recall if they speak to it directly. I'd have to rewatch the film. But maybe it's in the Jodie character who, in those opening scenes when she's dating Colt, what is she? I don't think she's the DP, but she's a camera person.
I think she's a camera operator. I think they say those words. Yeah.
So the fact that she goes from a camera operator within a calendar year to being a director on a Hollywood blockbuster movie, that's quite a leap. And maybe there's something within the subtext of that.
As a director for hire.
Yeah, like as a director for hire, she has no idea what she's doing. So like maybe that speaks to why the film looks the way that it does. Well, I don't know. Maybe I'm reaching there, but
I don't know. But I will give the film credit for being able to balance all of these ideas, because we talked about the idea of production interference, a love letter to the stunt community, the romantic comedy aspect of this. Those are a lot of very different avenues that could have felt very imbalanced, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that we're saying we probably could have even appreciated more of that commentary on what it means to be a director for hire potentially, or how the quote unquote ugliness of this movie, The Fall Guy, is perhaps part of the joke in some way.
Yeah.
The fact that they wouldn't feel out of place means the movie is at least doing something right, balancing all of these things.
Agree.
From a balancing act standpoint, the movie is pretty good at that, and I have to give it credit there.
I agree. No, I completely agree, especially coming off the heels of our conversation on How Green Was My Valley, where we talked about how that movie was 5 movies in one and fails because it struggles mightily to balance those 5 different through lines.
Sure.
And here's a movie that's doing something similarly in that regard in terms of the balls that it's juggling, but does it extremely well. And I agree with you. I think it's able to balance all of those tones, and it's really fun. I was always invested in the Colt Jodie relationship in terms of their dynamic. Of course, it's the chemistry between Gosling and Blunt for sure, but the playfulness of it all, I was invested. Then there's Colt as he's trying to find Tom, and what's the deal there? How does all of that come together? And ultimately, that through line does tether with the romantic comedy angle of the film. And ultimately, it tethers with Gail and her production interference and everything that we see. And of course, the action scenes at the end. It all comes together beautifully, even as an ode to being, or as a film being this love letter to the stunt community, right? Because you have that moment where Winston Duke's Dan character at the end, he brings all the stunt people together to fight, let's say, the antagonist, the villains of this film.
There was something cathartic about that.
Scene.
Yeah, that was, and how it's all filmed as well. I thought that was kind of neat too. So it becomes even not just about the stunt people, but really about those all behind the camera, right?
Yes.
Even the cinematographers have a play. The camera operators have a play with all of that. The key grips have a play in some way.
Absolutely.
It's a love letter to the people that aren't just the actors and the director. So I there was something cathartic about the idea of those final sequences. I will give you that.
Yeah, I agree. So yeah, I had a great time with this film. I guess the last thing I'll say, and then we can get to any other final thoughts.
Okay.
Ryan Gosling here is tremendous. He's having obviously a ton of fun. And it's not just the way he blends into the action, it's also how he taps into that pursuit of Jodie, and how at the right time he brings something true to Colt's motives. It's primarily very playful, his performance, the character, how it's rendered. And I love how he evokes frustration and desire simultaneously. It's very entertaining to watch how that is woven into the character. But I do love how he lands that emotional beat at the end. It's way better than it has any right to be. And it takes an actor working at his very best to be this cartoon essentially for much of the film, but make an emotional beat like that, which is obviously tonally very different in contrast to much of the film, to make that work and not feel jarring. But he doesn't overdo it.
He doesn't overdo it. And to go back to the Tropic Thunder comparison that we talked about earlier, there's a joke in that movie about how you don't go full blank. And I'm not going to say the word. But that's more or less why Ryan Gosling works in this movie, is that he doesn't go full, whatever that word is. He doesn't overdo the goofy side. He doesn't overdo the romantic side. There's something about Ryan Gosling in general. He's got a certain dryness to him that's not too dry, but also not too colorful. Like he's really good at straddling lines. I think that's what makes him so good.
And that's a great point, because when you couple it with, say, that moment with Aaron Taylor Johnson, which I love, that is a moment that is over the top, and it's meant to be. It is meant to be extremely cartoonish, but Gosling's performance here never really goes to those levels, or at least rarely it does, perhaps a few times, but mostly you're right. He reins that in just enough that we believe his frustrations, we believe his desires, we believe the guilt that he's feeling, we believe his romantic pursuits. And when it all coalesces, it makes for these contrasting moments with the character feel more reined in and not too dry. And like, it takes a special performer to be able to make that work. And I found that extremely incredible here.
He's good at he knows how to never be the loudest person in the room. And he's really good at balancing in that regard. He really is a tremendous movie star.
And he has to be one of the easiest actors to work with, because his chemistry with Blunt is ardent.
I want to hang out with the guy.
Incredible. But I think about his scenes here with Winston Duke, also fantastic.
It's a buddy comedy waiting to happen right there.
Yeah, his scenes with Hannah Weddingham is also fantastic. That's where the nihilism moment comes from. Like, their dynamics are very like. Yeah, his
dynamics with the unicorns are great.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, I love the film.
Yeah, I like it as well.
I urge everyone to go and check it out. Do you have any final thoughts on anything?
We did mention Winston Duke, really fantastic here. Should we talk a little bit about Stephanie Sue in this?
Yeah, we can talk Stephanie Sue. Yeah.
She's not bad in the movie, but man, what a waste. If there is one major problem with this movie, aside from some of the stuff I talked about and how we disagreed on maybe the rendering of the action scenes, that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem here is how you take a great actress like Stephanie Sue and do absolutely nothing with her.
Yeah, I agree.
That could have been played by anybody.
I agree. I don't know why you hire her for this role.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm always happy to see her. Don't get me wrong. I love Stephanie Sue, but I do agree that she is quite wasted in that role for sure.
Yeah.
That was probably my biggest issue with the movie.
Yeah. I think a lot of people have that same issue. I forget who it was, but I think I saw on Twitter someone made a comment that there's apparently a lot of ADR work on Stephanie Sue's character as well, which, if that's the case, that's even worse. But
I can see that, because other than that initial interaction they have, I mean, she's edited like the editing of the scene in which her character is in, like, we don't really.
And that's
see
the thing.
her face
She gives a lot of exposition, and a lot of it's flashback, right? So that's unfortunate that it makes it even worse that you have a great actress like this and you're not allowing her to act, right? And that's maybe she'll be in another Joyride sometime soon. That'll make up for it. Yeah, we need
another so one of those. Good there. Like, I mean, oh my
gosh,
I can see why you would want Stephanie Sue to be in your movie for sure. I hope she at least had fun, because she doesn't really have much to do here. But if she had fun, in her little role,
she did. She got to meet some good people. Yeah, so maybe.
Yeah. Who knows? I will say a couple of other things. I guess two other final thoughts. So we talked earlier about how this film has some interesting commentary to it as well.
Yeah.
I also think it's not clever, but I love how the film makes some commentary on AI as well, particularly deepfake technology.
Yeah. They very blunt. Again, you have to block your ears to miss it, or leave the room to miss it.
Yeah, but I love how the film pokes fun at that as well. And maybe that's the one aspect of the film that might be a little bit, I don't know, narcissistic maybe. I don't know, nihilistic. If it has any serious bone in its body, and I don't think it does, it might be with how it's kind of poking holes into the AI technology. But
yeah, but even so, it still has a little bit of fun with it when Gosling directly calls it, like a deep fake, right?
Yeah, like
when he actually calls attention to it in that way, there is still something very
it's still
tongue-in-cheek about
playful
it.
with how it's used for sure. But
yeah,
I just love how the film is kind of poking at that.
It's a fun movie.
There is a cameo at the end of this film. Beautiful, just so good. I love.
And it makes sense with the kind of movie they're making too.
It makes sense with the kind of movie they're making, and I also love that it's set up. So one of the references, and this film has a ton of references, but one of the movie that it references is Christopher Nolan's Memento.
Yeah,
and there's an element earlier in the film when I can't remember if it was Colt or Dan, but one of them picks up the sticky note there, and it has a reference to this actor's name.
Yep.
Which is a great gag on its own. And I would have been okay with it simply living on its own in that way. Would have made sense for this kind of movie.
Again, very literally.
But it's more foreshadowing than anything else. And when that actor shows up, it's so good. Loved it. Absolutely loved it.
That was fun. Another good sport there.
Yeah. The meta qualities of it all, just fantastic. And I can't emphasize enough that Aaron Taylor Johnson's speech is the funniest moment of the year. Honestly, one of my favorite scenes of the year so far.
I don't know what kind of accent he's doing, but man, I know what kind of accent he's doing.
Yeah.
But man, the fact that he just goes for it in that way is amazing.
Just absolutely goes for it.
Yes.
So good.
Yeah.
At any rate, I loved it. I hope people go see it. If you haven't seen it yet, I urge you to go and check it out. It's a good time. You know, regardless of where you fall on it, even if you agree with Brendan regarding the action scenes, and maybe you want to
see movies like this do well.
Yeah.
Then we don't get another $300 million budgeted IP movie that's where all the money is spent on rushed visual effects work and excess marketing, right?
Yeah.
We don't want to see that happen. We want to see movies like this do okay.
You want to support movies like this, and it's even with that aside, it's still a fun time. Like, it's a really fun time.
Yeah,
like, you're going to enjoy yourself. So I definitely urge people to go and check it out while it's still in theaters. I think it's worth seeing in theaters if you can. If you do see it and you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, you can leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube, or reach out to us on social media if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We really do appreciate that. You can always email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com as well. I think that's it. That's all that I have, unless you have anything else. Go ahead.
I was going to say, which one of us is the fall guy of this podcast?
Definitely the fall guy.
You have thrown me under the bus a few times on Twitter. I've seen that, so I guess I am.
Yeah, a few times, 10 times. Dave is the one that throws you under the bus more than me.
Well, he's still mad I don't like the movie Brooklyn.
Yeah. He subtweeted you the other day about that, by the way. I don't know.
I saw that. Yeah, that he still called it a perfect movie.
Yeah, exactly.
I need to rewatch it before I engage in any kind of conversation about that movie again.
Yeah, that's fair. Totally fair. At any rate, be sure to check out the main show this week, episode 584. We talked about How Green Was My Valley. We have another review coming out soon, The Idea of You, that romantic comedy. We'll be talking about that, so be on the lookout there. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd. Follow us on social media. Be sure to subscribe to the channel here if you're watching on YouTube or Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Please subscribe, rate and review us. Really helps out the show. Any final thoughts, Brendan, before we get out of here?
No, once again, I may not love the movie as much as you do, but I want it to succeed. I want to see a movie like this succeed. So hopefully it has an Elemental-like run.
I hope
which
so
can
too.
Still happen. It can still happen.
It can happen.
Yeah.
I hope word of mouth gets around. Hopefully this podcast will encourage at least one or two people to go to the theater to see it.
Yeah, it's one or two more than before. So that's a victory.
Yeah, I think it's really fun. It's a great time. you just have to, go in. Don't expect it to be John Wick or anything like that. It is a meta slapstick comedy at its core. So it's, you're going to have fun. Like Tropic Thunder is honestly a great comp. Like go in with that kind of mindset, you're going to have a great time.
Sure.
So anyway, with all of that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Give these stunt guys Oscars.
Forgot to talk about the soundtrack here. Good stuff.